I'm Dave Sabo. I'm kind of the resident blacksmith around here at Casa San Isidro. And we're going to talk a little bit about the history of blacksmithing, starting with the colonial movement of the Spanish coming into New Mexico. We'll talk about a little bit of New Mexico blacksmiths and the renaissance of blacksmithing that's happened in the near recent past, and then we'll do a little ironwork. This is a typical forge. We've got the tools that a typical blacksmith would have had around the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. We've got a forge here, a coal forge, a leg vise, and an anvil. This is generally all that was necessary for a blacksmith to really get his products out to the public. Just a little bit about blacksmithing here in New Mexico. Because of the distance between communities, it was very difficult to have blacksmiths everywhere, and so what you had was anytime there was a community, you had a blacksmith. You really couldn't have a community without a blacksmith because almost everything that was necessary for the communal living required metal work. Nails, your hinges for doors, your tools, any types of cooking utensils and silverware, or I guess ironware at the time. Almost anything like that. After the discovery of the New World by Spain, Columbus discovered it on behalf of Spain, the Spanish moved in more as conquerors. The conquistadors that came in the 15th century were really only looking for opportunities to get precious metals, gold and silver. And so mostly what they brought in were the soldiers and the basic miners and things who would help to find and locate that type of precious metals. They brought blacksmiths with them because the blacksmiths actually helped support the military. They brought a lot of soldiers in. So the horses needed to be shod, armor needed to be maintained. Any of the tools that the soldiers needed, such as their swords, or at the time when they were first using gunpowder, the blacksmiths were on hand to take care of all of that equipment. That basically lasted until, at least into New Mexico, as they moved into New Mexico, which was called the borderlands or the wild lands at the time. They moved into New Mexico and were unable to really locate any precious metals in New Mexico. They did a lot better conquering the Aztecs and Mayas down in Mexico and the peninsulas. Once they got into New Mexico, all they found were the Native Americans, who they basically used as servants and slaves and had them working for the Spanish at the time. That lasted up until the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. And at that time, the Indians just could not take the Spanish any longer, and they basically drove the Spanish out of the upper part of New Mexico, and they got into El Paso. And they took with them the blacksmiths, but they did leave some Indians who had familiarity with blacksmithing and were able to do things like make small implements, knives, and things like that. The Spanish came back in afterwards, and as an example, in 1693, a gentleman, at the time he was an adopted child, came up out of Mexico. His name was Bernardo de Sena. And he traveled with his adopted family, and they moved up into the Santa Fe area, and Sena's located a farm, a ranch just north of Santa Fe. And about 18, at the age of 18, Bernardo started working as a blacksmith in Santa Fe. And his legacy was that each of his sons and grandsons and great-grandsons after that followed him. The Senas were blacksmiths in Santa Fe until about 1920. They were fairly prosperous, and blacksmiths were held in very high regard at the time. So they were prosperous and did well. Some of their equipment has actually been found and located by Frank Turley and Mark Simmons, and it's identified in some of the articles that Mark Simmons wrote for the Santa Fe New Mexican. We'll talk a little bit more about Simmons and Turley and the book that they wrote. I'll show you a picture of it in just a second. But blacksmithing in New Mexico then kind of reached its peak in the, I guess, from about 1910 on. There were blacksmiths, as I said, located all over New Mexico, which were, basically helping to support the small communities. I know that, like in Corona, for example, there was still a blacksmith operating there until 1950. And there is a blacksmith still in Magdalena who does work for people that have things that need to be repaired. Sandia Laboratories had their blacksmith until 1998. It was operated by a world famous blacksmith, Rob Gunter, who's still a blacksmith and lives in Edgewood. But so blacksmithing is still a viable art right now, but it kind of started at a renaissance about the 1970s. People had sort of lost track of blacksmithing and really weren't doing any real blacksmithing except for a very small group. And around 1970, we started to see people become interested in old techniques, old ways of doing things. And from the 70s on, there's been a real resurgence in blacksmithing, and now there's blacksmiths all over the United States and in fact all over the world. There's a website called iForge Iron, which has 41,000 blacksmiths located all over the world, representing 141 countries. Blacksmithing has become an art. In fact, now there is a large organization in the United States. It's got thousands of members. I'm a member of that, and the nice thing about that is it's really an educational type of organization. It's teaching people, teaching students how to do blacksmithing so that they can go on their own. Here in New Mexico, Frank Turley established a blacksmithing shop in Santa Fe in the early 70s, and it's the oldest blacksmithing school in the United States. In fact, just recently, the Artist Blacksmith Association of America awarded him their Heritage Award, which is the first time it's ever been awarded to an individual. Usually it's large organizations, just because of the work that he's done teaching students. He's had over 1,600 students go through his classes, and many of them are still working here in the United States, but they come from all over the world. Okay, all of the iron that was used in the New World by Spain had to be imported by Spain because at the time they hadn't located high quality iron deposits. And so Toledo, Spain was really known for the quality of the iron that they used for their swords and armor and things like that. So they brought it in huge billets. That they used it as the ballast in the ships when they were coming over, and that metal then had to be used and reused. And so what you find a lot of times is that some of the implements like we've got here on the table that I'll show you in just a second actually were probably used first as some other implement and then reused to actually make things like say this ladle, which is hand pounded out. Started out as probably a fairly small piece of steel that was pounded out flat. The same with this. This was probably from something else and then was pounded into the shape. But you can see the symmetry of the work that was actually done by pounding out from probably a small single piece of steel into this. This was heated, reheated, pounded out, and reheated. And then the quality of the workmanship that's gone into making this handle is fairly impressive because, you'd think that it would be somewhat rough, but the quality of how they did it, that it's half round and then flattened out. It's got a scroll at the end of it. So this is, the blacksmiths at the time really were very cautious about how they did their work so that the quality was always there. They actually had a guild of blacksmiths that made sure that nobody could be considered a master blacksmith until they'd achieved that over a long period of time, of both working as an apprentice and then as a journeyman before they could become a master blacksmith. The same is true of this scoop. Now, this appears to be some type of, like a spatula, but actually what this is a coal shovel for getting your coal or hot ashes out if you're going to heat things up from a fire. It's missing one rivet, but you can still see how much work would have gone into this. This is actually a heavy piece of metal that was pounded out, and then the handle the same way was pounded out. But you notice the little doodad at the end, which is pounded out into an octagon, and very well done. I mean, it's missing a rivet. You can see how it moves, but this was used for scooping out hot ashes and probably coal for heating in some type of probably a dwelling. But this was all pounded out of one single piece of steel. This would be typical as of a type of gate pull. This one is fairly rough, and that's because I did it. A gate pull that I was making at the time, and I wound up not needing as large a piece as I did. The most common things that blacksmiths made were nails. That's probably the most important thing that they were making from early on in the colonial periods all the way up through the 1920s here in the United States were nails, because you couldn't get nails shipped in. You didn't have a store to go buy them at. So a blacksmith had an apprentice who would sit all day long and make nails in large quantities. And when they were really very good at making nails, they could make probably 10 to 15, even 20 a minute if they were fast and were doing it well. And it would take some time to actually learn that. I make nails, but it takes me a little bit longer. They're basically made rectangular and then pounded through what's called the nail header to put the top on them and make them flat. And you can see, if you want, here in the door, these are all made out of handmade nails. The doors that are here in Casa San Isidro. One of the other things that was pretty common, and I mentioned that they would make utensils for cooking, is a plancha. And that you can see how this has been hand pounded. You can see all of the different hand pound marks all over it. It's been used for many years. You can see how it's finally started to deteriorate. But it's actually a very well made utensil. So this would be used for making tortillas and probably anything else that was necessary for a kitchen that could be used on, if they were making a type of biscuit or bread. Another example of the work that blacksmiths would do is to fabricate heavy pieces of equipment, metal for wagons and carts and things like that. So this is actually a hand-forged chain, and you can see that there's some irregularity in it. You can see where each of the links were rounded out and then they were hand-forged together. So you get this whole piece. And so some pieces are slightly larger than other ones, some are slightly smaller. But this is a real good example and a real rare example of the type of work that a blacksmith would do. And if you can imagine how much work went into this, I mean, literally it would take hours to make each one of these pieces. So this is a really pretty unique piece. You can see too that it was originally round, and over time it's actually worn down to where you've got the inside has been smoothed out, made flat from constantly being worked. And these were made out of probably large thick pieces of steel that were then hand pounded around a mandrel to get them round like this. Okay, now we're cooking. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to take a round piece of metal and I'm going to shape it into the type of object that a blacksmith would have made probably in colonial Spain. This would be like a hanging hook for the wall, would be pounded into the wall. So what I want to do first is I'm going to take this round piece and make it square. I have to get it out of there first. It slipped way back in there. Okay, let me get it hot now. It's not getting hot enough. Yeah, we'll use that. Okay, so we're going to make it square. Now the reason that we make it square like that is so that you can, if you put a twist on round metal, it's just as round. But when you twist something that's square, you'll show a spiral. So we're going to heat it back up again. I got to pound a little bit more. I want to get it pretty much as square as possible so that the definition of the spiral is going to look real nice. So we'll heat it up one more time and then we'll twist it. So, to create a spiral on the metal. So you can see how we've got now a nice spiral. All right, now I'm going to heat each end. Once I got the point made, then I'm going to make it round again. So you can see I've got now, it's squared on the end, but that's how you draw it out. Now I'm going to go ahead and round it before the metal gets too cold. Okay, put it back in the fire. Push this over. We have a little tiny curlicue. I'm going to make the curlicue cool than the rest of the metal so that I can then make a hook. Make sure it's all nice and rounded. So now we have the beginning of the hook. Now we'll heat the other end. And there's several different ways we can finish off the other end. I'm actually going to make it into a type of a spike that could be driven into the wood and used to hang pots or other utensils. So now we're going to take this and I'm going to draw this out to a point again like I did the other side. I'm going to make this into a longer, thinner point so that it can be easily driven into wood. One more time to get it nice and hot. Have to get my point real sharp. Around it. Yeah, you want to get it to a temperature where it was that orange to yellow heat. That's at about 2,000 degrees to 2,100. So that's the best working temperature, but as soon as you touch the top of the anvil, which is cold, it immediately starts to cool off. So what you're trying to do is work it as fast as you can, and it's, you know, it has to move fairly quickly to be able to do that. So you can see at that temperature we're probably 2,200 degrees up here, but you can see how fast it's starting to cool already. So I'm going to continue trying to round it out to keep my point real sharp. Get it all pretty straight. So that's how our final hook's going to look. If we go into the wood, we pound it in just like a nail into it so that it holds. There's a crack right there. It holds a utensil or a pot, pan, one of the fireplace utensils. So that's our final design. Let's make sure it's straight. I'm going to put some wax on it. This is a preservative. It keeps it from rusting. So you put a little beeswax on it. And do the other end. The metal's so hot right now that it not only melts the beeswax, but then it dries it off too. So it forms a protective coat on the outside. And this is a lot like, this is a very simple type of piece of utensil to make, but this is what, you know, Spanish colonial or even modern blacksmiths make for uses in kitchens. So there we go, final piece. Does use all of the techniques that you would that any blacksmith would use when they were making any of the types of utensils we showed out there on the table. But you know, you can see where they had bends and twists on it. But this is, you know, fairly quick and fairly simple. All my life I've been an office jockey, but this is what I've always really wanted to do, is to be able to make hands-on types of, you know, different sorts of items, things that, you know, not only are functional but can be artistic at the same time. So this actually is something that I had aspired to for years and really couldn't do until I was able to retire. I mean, I was able to do it, you know, as a hobby, but now I've been doing it professionally now for some time. This is the book by Frank Turley and Mark Simmons, Spanish Colonial Ironwork. It's out of print right now. I see copies are still available on ABE Books, and Amazon looks like they were advertising a couple of them too. Since Frank's a personal friend of mine, he autographed this a while back. But it's a really, really good explanation of how the ironwork was done here in New Mexico. And a lot of the pictures that are in here are actually pieces of artwork and metalwork that are down in the museum, the Art and History Museum of Albuquerque here in Old Town. So you can see a lot of the fine quality work that was done by the blacksmiths years and years ago. The locks that go on the doors here were actually made by Tom Joyce, who's a world famous blacksmith. He's probably one of the best blacksmiths in the world. You can see how unique they are and how well they're designed. These are probably better quality than you'd find, certainly by machine making. The strap hinges and all that were also made by Tom. The workmanship you can see on them is very, very fine. All of these were hand done. Tom was actually asked to help construct the Twin Tower Memorial after the 9/11 incident. He lives here in northern New Mexico still, has a shop, and does phenomenal work. This type is actually, you first do a slice into it, kind of like you would here, and then you pound it over the horn of the anvil to get it. It's just that you don't see, that type of perfect symmetry on most of them. It's really hard to do. The little blacksmith shop that's here at Casa San Isidro is actually a recreation of what you would have seen in the 19th century here in New Mexico. It's very much like what would have been found in a hacienda or in a small community. It has all of the equipment, real equipment, that was used at that time. And I mentioned each of the different types of tools we've got. But I teach a class for UNM's continuing education department. And you can find that online when they go back to actually offering classes again. But we teach it here, and I teach a small class of usually 6 students. And we take the time to do exactly what we did today, something very similar to this. I leave it up to the students. I show them 3 or 4 different designs, and they can make those themselves. And I help them go through it. It's about a 5-hour class, but it's a fun class, and everybody that takes it really enjoys it. And I think some of them will actually go on and do blacksmithing. Much of the equipment that was put in here was actually furnished by the New Mexico Artist Blacksmith Association. This anvil was found and put here, and this is an exceptionally rare anvil. This one was probably made around in the 1850s, and it's a fairly unique anvil in that it's hardened tool steel across the whole top. The old anvil that used to be in here is down on the floor. The leg vise is probably from around 1890 to 1910, somewhere in there. The forge that we were using today is actually one that could have been found in a Sears and Roebuck catalog around 1900 to 1910, and was probably fairly expensive at the time. I would say, in fact, I've got a Sears catalog that shows it right at $19. So at that time, that was a very, very expensive piece of equipment. And this is a big forge that would be used in a big shop. The tools that I'm using, the small tools, are all exactly the same as blacksmiths would have made and used. They would have made most of the tools themselves, and I've made a lot of my own tools. But these are the same tools that would have been used from the 1600s on. They would have used these very same types of tools.